everybody. Welcome back. Good morning. I'm Yvonne Mintz. I'm editor and publisher of the Facts newspaper in Brazoria County. And the title of our session is Looking Ahead, but we also need to look at the good and the ugly of the session that just passed. And we have a panel of people who lived and breathed it this year for us. And I'll introduce them. We have James Quintero at the end of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Then we have Laura Prather and Arif Punju, attorneys and co-chairs of the Freedom of Information Foundation Legislative Committee. Thank you in advance for all of the knowledge you're going to impart on us today and the work that you've done in this challenging year. We also had another panelist who you'll see in your program who was to be with us today on Zoom. Senator Judith Zaffirini actually is unable to appear with us live because she's in a redistricting hearing and was not able to tear herself away. We were going to ask her about a big victory that she had this session, a bill that guarantees the public's right to know about COVID and other communicable diseases outbreaks in our nursing homes and assisted living facilities. She's recorded some thoughts for us about that, which we'll hear now.
Thank you, Yvonne, for your warm and generous introduction, and thank you and the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas for the opportunity to look back at the 2021 legislative session before looking ahead to 2023. When my dear and valued friend and former student, Diana Fuentes, invited me to serve on today's panel, I said that I would, unless a legislative conflict developed. Sure enough, the Senate Redistricting Committee on which I serve is meeting at 10 a.m. today, so I thank you for accommodating me via Zoom. I thought about you when I read a statement attributed to Plato. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when adults are afraid of the light. Incredibly, in this day and age, there are still government officials who resist sunshine laws and, in fact, also resist most efforts to strengthen our open government laws. That persistent resistance is what makes your work so important, so impressive. Ensuring freedom of information is the cornerstone to our belief that transparency is essential to preserving democratic governance. You may be the only civic or professional organization that has a biblical standard. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I believe strongly we should not tolerate public officials who do not want to make the truth public and who persist in working secretly behind closed doors and shuttered windows. To hold their leaders accountable, Texans need to know what happens in the rooms and halls of power. The more complicated our government becomes, the greater the potential damage of poor stewardship or of outright abuse, and the greater the need for transparency. This is especially true during emergencies, whether they're winter storms, pandemics, or even recessions. The public's right to the truth never changes, but the need for it is never greater than during a crisis. This is why during our most recent challenging times, for example, my staff and I welcome the opportunity to collaborate with you in writing open government legislation. I wish I could be part of today's panel that will discuss legislative outcomes and beyond, but I'm delighted to share my perspective about looking back at 2021 before looking ahead at 2023. It was my pleasure to work with many of you to develop our 2021 legislative priorities. Our efforts included co-hosting a Zoom webinar titled Government Transparency During Emergencies. We reached 2,500 persons with that webinar, and 104 commented during its broadcast. Legislative suggestions generated from that interaction and other sources were related to your theme, Overcoming the Information Lockdown. When the COVID-19 pandemic began last year, my staff and I began receiving reports that family members were being denied access to information about the safety of nursing homes where their loved ones resided. I can only imagine the anxieties those families felt. As we investigated, we learned that advocates and journalists also were being denied access to information by state and local government officials. That's why some of you and I decided to address this issue by filing my Senate Bill 930. Thank God it was signed by the governor and became effective September 1st. It provides that the name or location of long-term care facilities in which residents have been diagnosed with communicable diseases and the number of residents diagnosed are not confidential unless defined as such by another law. Such information is now subject to disclosure by state agencies or local health authorities under the Texas Public Information Act. The impact of this new law has been comforting to families and empowering to journalists. I also filed Senate Bill 925, which sought to close a loophole that allows some entities to avoid public information requests permanently by claiming every day as a skeleton crew day, not as a business day. Such an excuse for skirting defined response times is unthinkable, and that loophole must be closed. Passing that bill should be high on our priority list for 2023. Other failed bills that we should file anew are Senate Bill 927, which would have created a complaint mechanism at the Attorney General's office for requesters to report government bodies that fail to respond to public information requests, and Senate Bill 924, which would have protected the public's right to participate in open meetings held via teleconference or video conference. Clearly, the legislative package we developed was as timely and thorough as it was important and necessary. Had external forces not reduced the number of days the legislature met or caused committees to delay holding hearings, I believe we would have passed all, if not most, of our bills. My staff and I tried mightily, including by repeatedly requesting hearings and by visiting with the committee chair at his desk in the Senate. What we heard is that the legislature already had passed so many government bills, and that because of the late start caused by the pandemic, fewer bills would be passed this session. They were. By way of example, in 2021, the legislature passed only 3,803 of the 9,999 bills filed. That is 778 fewer, or 8% less, than in 2019. That session, we passed 4,581 of the 10,877 bills filed. If there is anything I know as a legislator, it's how to pass bills. Because my staff and I work so hard with so many groups like you, I've passed more bills than any other legislator in the history of the state of Texas. And as a Democrat in a Republican-dominated legislature, I passed 106 bills this year, making me the highest bill passer for the 4th consecutive session. Open government bills will remain at the top of my agenda as we prepare for 2023. I hope that even more of you will collaborate with us in reviewing those we didn't pass and in determining if we have to amend them in any way before pre-filing them on November 14th, 2022. That's only 14 months away. The Senate Business and Commerce Committee, where many open government bills died, is likely to continue to be the committee of jurisdiction for our efforts. I've asked the Lieutenant Governor to appoint me to that committee again, and he seemed favorable. The new committee chair, Senator Charles Schwertner, is a good friend, and it will be easy for me to discuss our freedom of information priorities with him. I hope you will too. I also hope that as we look ahead and plan ahead during the interim at hand, we will reflect the beautiful words by President John F. Kennedy. We must never forget that the free flow of information is essential to a democratic society. Thank you for everything you do and everything you will do to promote open and transparent state government. My prayer is that the Lord will bless you for your good work and inspire you to continue to excel.
Thank you to Senator Zaffarini and her office for putting that together today. I wish that she could have joined us because I think that she deserves our thanks for the work that she did this year. The pandemic brought to to light weaknesses in the current law, including the need for uniformity in the way that information was coming out to us. I know in our county, we're getting the information about nursing homes and assisted living facilities, but some of my friends and journalists in other communities were not getting that. Laura, can you tell us a little bit more about Senator Zaffarini's work on that and why that measure was so important to get across the finish line?
Sure. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the problem was that the Health and Human Services Commission was not giving out COVID information involving nursing homes or assisted living facilities. And they weren't just not giving it out to the public. In fact, they weren't giving it out to family members. And so you had family members that didn't know whether or not their loved one was living in a COVID hotspot or not. You had them not knowing whether, if they wanted to move their loved one, if they would be moving them into a place more dangerous for them to live or not. And this issue, this roadblock that was presented, ended up going through the AG process. And what the Health and Human Services Commission said that they were concerned about was, we don't want to give out information that is protected by HIPAA. We're concerned that if we give out this information, we're going to be violating the federal law concerning giving out information that is health information about individuals. FOIFT and several other organizations filed a letter with the Attorney General's office explaining this is not personal, sensitive health information about any individuals. We're talking about aggregate data. We're talking about the data of percentages of people that are getting this deadly disease in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And that aggregate data does not identify any single person. Ultimately, the AG's office did agree that the Health and Human Services Commission should be disclosing this information. It did not fall within the purview of HIPAA, and that the aggregate data was to be given to the public. The problem is that's an AG decision. That's not a statute. The other problem is that doesn't deal with your local health authority. And the local health authorities were still saying, HIPAA, 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 we are not going to give out this information. And so there needed to be a legislative fix. There needed to be a law on the books that would address this problem, both from a statewide perspective and from a local health authority perspective. And that's the core of the bill that Senator Zaffarini got passed. It was Senate Bill 930, and it was sponsored by Senator Zaffarini in the Senate and by Mays Middleton in the House. I don't know that you could think of two people that come from more opposite views of the political spectrum, yet they both agreed that this was a significant issue for Texas citizens that needed to be passed. In addition, there was a huge assist from Senator Kolkhorst, who was the chair of Health and Human Services in the Senate. She actually had a similar bill, and she opted to have the hearing go forward on Senator Zaffarini's bill. And she did so early in the session so that we had enough momentum going into those, waning days of session where we were able to get it passed. Because as y'all know, you're against the clock the entire time. So we had some tremendous supporters on this. I think people saw the need and wanted to rectify the problem. I only wish that we could have done it for the jail system as well, and others that have continued to put up roadblocks to accessing this information, as you heard about during the prior panel. But this was a significant public policy measure that was passed last session.
James, anything you'd like to add on Senator Zaffarini's work in this session, this bill in particular, or others that she worked for?
Sure. Well, it's actually unfortunate that she's not here, because I think she deserves lots of praise for bringing forward a really comprehensive legislative package that was a really good one. And I really was sad to see that many of those bills met an unfortunate end. But Laura actually touched on something that I think is important to emphasize. There's a diversity of perspectives behind this open government issue that exists in really very few other issues. maybe criminal justice reform, maybe economic development, but it really comes together here in the transparency world. And I think that's encouraging, right? We live in some very divisive times, but even still, there are some issues that we can all agree on. Now, when I look at this issue myself, I think about transparency and why it matters. And many of you have maybe even heard this. I always come back to the opening preamble of Chapter 552 of the Open Government Code, which sounds boring and kind of is, but there's a really good illustration at the opening that says this. It talks about why transparency matters. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. Right? In order for us to operate in our democratic society, we need this free flow of information. And that was lacking in a really big way at a critical time last year. And so while there were many bills from Senator Zaffarini and others that didn't make it through this legislative session, I feel really encouraged by what's coming up in 2023, because I think you're going to see that same energy and maybe even a little bit greater interest in pushing forward a lot of these ideas that didn't quite make it across the finish line this time.
Well, you stole my next question. Very good, thank you. Senator Zaffarini did seem optimistic about the chances of this slate of legislation moving forward. Do you share that optimism, members of our panel?
I think so. I think, if you look at the emergency we came out of, the emergency, if you view it through the lens of the government, was an opportunity to exercise power and an opportunity to just rely on those levers because that's what it does on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, emergencies are when you want to have more information.
Right.
Emergencies are when you want to know if the government is doing what it's primarily designed and created to accomplish, protect rights. And unfortunately, because of the way the culture, I guess, within governmental offices that deal with public information, where you err on the side of withholding by reaching to the hundreds of exceptions under the law that have been baked in, as opposed to recognizing what James points out, the very purpose and construct and structure of the law, that's all lost because the government's just focused on exercising power. And what gets lost in the mix is you should recognize, if you're a public official or if you're entrusted with those levers of power, that when there is an emergency, you have to trust the people. And you have to give them the information and get out of the way as much as possible. But unfortunately, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about some other items that kind of fall within the line of let's try to construe this open government law as narrowly as possible, make it as difficult as possible to get information. That culture needs to come to an end. And I think what we can do is point to the emergency over the past 18 months and show that government really has it flipped on its head. And it's cost people in the emergency setting, it's cost people in the law enforcement setting, and it was a lifting of the veil on the consequences on having a baked-in environment where you're not trying to help information go out, but trying to shield it. That has consequences, and that came to a head during COVID, because everything was shut down, from skeleton crews to nursing homes and everything else, when the exact opposite should have been happening for everyone's benefit. And so I think that coming into the new session, there will be lawmakers like Zaffarini, like Schwertner, who she mentioned as well, and like Mays Middleton, who recognize the crux of the issue, which is in times of emergency, or even in times of not emergency, you have to take the structure and purpose of the TPIA seriously, and then proceed from that. Not just resort to the bureaucratic mechanics of reaching for exceptions as a matter of course, because that proved consequential during a pandemic, and it should never happen again.
Absolutely. Well, Senator Zaffarini's bill, and one by Senator Joan Huffman, which updates existing law to clarify how governmental bodies can use the catastrophe notice provision of the Texas Public Information Act, were successes for open government this year. Let's go a little bit more into that. Laura, tell us about the catastrophe notice provision and what problems were occurring because of that.
Sure. So going into the pandemic, well, let me take a step back. Let's take a step back to the prior session. Okay, so Hurricane Harvey hits. decimates parts of Houston. There are several governmental bodies that simply can't function. They can't get to their office. They can't access their computers. They can't do anything. They're underwater. With that backdrop, not last session, but the session before, a law was passed by Senator Joan Huffman that provided for the ability for a governmental entity during a catastrophe to essentially put in a notice with the AG's office saying, yeah, we need a stop, we need a timeout from the TPIA because we can't function right now. And, you know, we need this for 7 days and then we will reevaluate. You can see how that would make sense under the circumstances of a Hurricane Harvey situation. What happened when COVID hit, though, was the governor declared a state of emergency, and tons of different counties, tons of different organizations, police, school districts, et cetera, put in catastrophe notices with the AG's office, and then just renewed them and renewed them and renewed them. There were some that renewed them up to 8 times, which is never what the law was intended to do, because by the time you're renewing it for the 8th time, your people are working remotely, they're accessing documents on their computers, they're still collecting a paycheck, they've just pivoted to be able to work in a different environment. And yet they're still telling Texas citizens, time out, we don't have to comply with any of your TPIA requests. And staggeringly, during this same period of time, some of these governmental entities were requesting an increase in their budget for their PIA departments, who were doing nothing. So the hypocrisy is significant here. And you really have organizations that were just taking advantage of the system. School districts in particular, who were, you know, planning their remote schooling, and yet, you know, here they are planning a whole different way to teach our children, and yet they're saying, we're not working and we're not going to respond to your request. This happened both through the catastrophe notice provision, but also under the Attorney General's skeleton crew guidelines. So the skeleton crew guidelines were passed a long time ago, or issued a long time ago, and those were issued by the Attorney General to deal with the occasional snow day. There's a snow day, we can't get into our office, you know, it doesn't count in the 10 days for responding to a TPIA request. They were not intended to be, we are a year and 6 months into a catastrophe, we are all collecting a paycheck, and yet we're going to thumb our nose at the PIA. And that is what has happened. And so this catastrophe notice bill, and also a parallel bill that we had filed last session, dealt with the abuse of the catastrophe notice provision and dealt with the abuse of the skeleton crew guidelines. The skeleton crew standalone bill did not pass, but the catastrophe notice reform bill did, and there's a couple of things that are significant about it. It was SB 1225, Joan Huffman's office and Chris Patty's office were the 2 sponsors of it. Senator Huffman, to her credit, said, look, if the bill that I passed last session is getting abused, I want to fix that. And so she tightened up the language as to what a catastrophe means. And instead of just saying that it means a condition or an occurrence that interferes with the ability of a governmental body to comply with the act, she said it has to directly interfere. So if there's a brush fire down the road, but it's not interfering with your office's ability to respond to PIA requests, you don't get to claim catastrophe. She also tightened it up so that it says that it doesn't mean a period when staff is required to work remotely and can access information responsive to an application for information, even if the physical office is closed. So tightening up the ability to not abuse the system. She also said it only applies once for each catastrophe. You only get 7 days for each catastrophe. And then you also have a provision in the end that is significant to everyone, which is a new section 552.2211 that might be a solution to the skeleton crew problem. talks about the fact that, except as provided by the catastrophe notice section, if a governmental body closes its physical office but requires staff to work, including remotely, then the governmental body shall make a good faith effort to continue responding to applications for public information to the extent staff have access to that information that is responsive to a TPIA request, even if their offices are closed. So our hope is that people will know, that the governmental entities will no longer try to use the skeleton crew, but if they do, there is a new provision under the law, 552.2211, that you can look to address the invocation of that skeleton crew provision. Our other hope, and you'll hear from one of the AG candidates during lunch, is that any incoming AG, if it is a different AG, will do away with this really no longer needed AG guideline. Now that we have a catastrophe notice provision in the law, that guideline is no longer needed, and it's only there so that people can abuse it.
And just to add a little something to what Laura said, you know, as all of us advocates were pushing on this particular piece of legislation, it kind of made me laugh and cry simultaneously as I was testifying before the committee to note that, you know, you had cities like Dallas who had effectively shut down their open government process in March of 2020, and even as we were testifying before the committee in March and April of 2021, those same systems were still shut down. So if you had submitted a Public Information Act request on something of importance in, let's say, mid-February of 2020, you still wouldn't know at the time that this legislation was moving through the process what your answer was. And so I think that's, you know, very problematic. Laura also said that, you know, some of these jurisdictions were increasing the size of their budgets even while their departments were shut down. And as a fiscal conservative, it really troubles me. There was one example in particular where you had the city of San Antonio during the pandemic increase its open government department's budget by 20%. Even while its systems were shut down. And so, you know, these were some of the frustrations that kind of initiated a lot of the legislation, and I think this particular bill is going to improve the process in some really good ways.
James, if I can get you to expand on that some. We saw success with the catastrophe notice provision, and Laura mentioned how that could apply to the skeleton crew as well. What work remains to be done in that area, considering the skeleton crew closed office bill itself was held up?
Yes, so I believe there was a bill, HB 1416, that would have better defined business day for the purpose of the PIA. I believe that one fell short. That's going to be the focus of some attention moving forward. Another one that, it's a smaller bill, but it speaks to my heart because I'm a data person. There was a bill, HB 1810, that would have required a governmental entity to produce information in the format that the requester requests. So if you, let's say, wanted to have access to a budget, and you requested that governmental entity send it in the same form that it has it couldn't just send you a scanned PDF, right? And I'm a big Control F guy. I like to do quick searches through budgets and Excel sheets and all these types of things. And this would have required that kind of response from governmental entities. Unfortunately, that one fell short too. There's also another one that would have required a response in a timely way from governmental entities and structured in something of, I believe these were incentives. They didn't go with the punitive process, but this one was HB 3015. So there's some bills in there for our Open Government Coalition to focus on in the future. Again, though, I feel really encouraged by what Laura and Kelly in particular have put together. They have an absolutely stellar group that they've been able to form. Took the form of the Sunshine Coalition in 2019, the Transparent and Accountable Government Coalition this session. We're looking forward to what they have in store in 23, but they have really brought together the left, the right, and the middle, all aimed at making strong improvements to open government.
You touched on a bit, I think, the searchable, sortable records bill that we it's been something that has been a priority of, I know, data journalists and being able to tell their stories with less grunt work and more success. Tell me more about that and what roadblocks journalists have come across in getting that information in a form that makes it easily manageable, and what we're working on that. Lord, can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, this is a bill that we've tried a couple of sessions to get passed, and data journalists like Eva Ruth and others who are in the room probably can speak to, you know, the daily headaches that it causes when a governmental entity gives you something in a PDF format rather than in the format in which it is kept. It certainly was something that came up with the ERCOT shutdown of various power grids. A lot of the information that they provided, to the extent that they provided information to the public, was in PDF format. It was not in any sort of searchable, sortable format, which made it very difficult for people to be able to, you know, look at, okay, what exactly did they do here? And so we have come at this a couple of different ways. We tried session before last to have an agreed upon measure that would address this problem. And I will tell you what the opponents say about this is a complete red herring, but they talk about it being a security risk. It's a security risk if they give you this information in an Excel spreadsheet, which is absurd. But that comes from very old, agey opinions in which they were talking about codes, code language, software code, and how you could break in if you had the software code to the systems. And so that's sort of the, you know, doomsday approach that opponents take to this. They're trying to get at our code, and then you're going to have computer hackers come in, and then the world's going to come to an end if we give this to them in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's important to be able to address those myths. And in this particular bill was carried by Senator Zaffarini in the Senate, but it was also carried, and actually Senator Johnson carried a parallel bill in the Senate, but it was carried by Representative Capriglione in the House. And Representative Capriglione talks the talk. He knows and he can ferret out the BS when people start talking about this doomsday scenario. And he's very good at explaining it to others. And so hopefully we'll be able to continue to work with him on this, because he really is somebody that is well respected in this regard and can explain why this is not going to cause the hacking that people profess that it will cause.
Thank you. Another area where we've seen some possible faults in the law come through under the lens of the pandemic, many more entities are holding online public meetings. And this seems like a no-brainer to me, why a telephone call-in line is so essential versus simply a Zoom code where you can tune into the live stream. Arif, can you address that, why that telephone call-in line is important to advocates, and why it seems like that's not common sense to everyone?
It's 2021. People use the phone, people use the internet. They still use both to communicate. If the government's going to project information that affects their lives over the internet, and it resorts to that as opposed to holding a meeting and opening the doors for people to come to one location if it decides to project it outwards. There's going to be a contingency of folks that aren't down with using Zoom or sitting down with a laptop to watch their government. They're going to call in and listen in. Some people may do it online on a live feed and just listen in on their phone. Some people may just want to call in to a line, something that they are used to doing, conference calls, something that they're used to doing because they've primarily used their phone their entire life to communicate. They just didn't want to, kind of go the route of some of us that grew up in a different era with the internet. That's important, and it's a no-brainer for the government to recognize that when the TPIA or TOMA guarantees people access or all persons information, that there's going to be myriad ways that people want to access information. Nonetheless, when there's an opportunity to narrow the funnel, government generally will use the bureaucratic morass that it has to narrow the funnel of information. And unfortunately, that's translated to open meetings too. And it was important to button that up and stop that before you have a whole swath of the population that don't have access to their own government and what's going on. Because the government has decided to narrow the funnel of where those open meetings would be projected to in the internet. So having the ability to participate in an easy way is the low-hanging fruit for government. And again, if it recognizes that the leadership in these municipalities and agencies recognize that it's their obligation to properly frame the PIA for their government employees and their officials and say, look, we want to get as many people involved as possible here, you don't need a bill like this. You don't need a skeleton crew bill. But that's not what we're dealing with. And again, the pandemic has lifted the veil on what the MO is here, and that is to kind of treat the public and public information requests or open meetings as mere inconveniences. Check the box type thing. And that's not what they're there for. They're there to guarantee that we have a properly functioning government, and everyone working in it should be happy about that. And so the bill, and I think Laura has something to say about this, in terms of the mechanics, allows people to participate more fully, more easily in the government that they fund and they've created. And just the mere fact that we needed a bill to rectify this should be shocking to most people who believe in a robust democracy or constitutional republic, whichever way you come to view your government, because it's unacceptable that you just say, that's the one way you can do it, and if you don't, tough luck. Government has plenty of resources. I don't see them going down. I see them going up, at least living here in Austin. And there's no excuse for not having a wide, broad swath of information or access for the public. So this is what this bill accomplished, because there's certain populations that just aren't zooming around.
Well, we've seen a really clunky, I think, rollout, particularly, in my view, with smaller governments. That's what I deal in. Really clunky rollout of this online meeting option that also has seemed as in some cases, some are doing it right. I cover lots of cities. Some are doing it right, have the right heart for it. Others are seeing this as an excuse to cut off public comment in these online meetings. Well, you can listen in, but we aren't going to allow you to address us because technologically that's a little tricky. Is that something that you're hearing from around the state, Laura, and what is in the works to try to address that?
Yeah, that is something that we're hearing complaints about, and it will need to be addressed. It is a no-brainer, as Arif said, but I think moving forward, what we need to do is we need to work on our messaging and we need to work on our strategy. I think our messaging needs to focus on the fact that this is a disenfranchisement issue. You're disenfranchising members of the public from engaging in their government. We're focused so much on the digital divide without access for rural communities for broadband. By not having a call-in number, that's a large swath of Texas that is no longer allowed to participate in their government if we're only doing meetings by Zoom. So messaging-wise, I think we've got some improvement that we need to make on this. Strategically, this is the only bill. This bill was HB 2683 and SB 924. We had a platform, just to give you a little perspective, we had a platform of 8 different bills that we went into session with, that the Transparent and Accountable Government Coalition was advocating for passage of. And as James mentioned, that coalition is a broad-based coalition with organizations on both sides of the aisle supportive of increasing transparency in government. 2 out of our 8 initiatives passed. That's actually a pretty good success rate. Most of the time, 17 to 18% of the bills pass in the Texas legislature. We had 25% of our agenda pass. Still disappointing in the sense that 6 bills didn't pass. This particular bill is the only bill that had 2 Democrat sponsors. We did a really good job with all of our bills of having an R and a D on them. This bill had 2 Ds. It never even got referred to committee in the Senate. Every one of our bills got out of the House, and every one of those bills that went to the Senate, other than this one, was referred to Senate B and C, Business and Commerce Committee, or in the case of nursing home, to Lowest School Course Committee. And the bills that died in the Senate, 5 bills that died in the Senate, didn't get hearings from the Senate B and C chair. No explanation other than, as Senator Zaffarini indicated, we've already passed enough open government bills. Interesting.
And just to piggyback off that, you heard the statistics earlier from Senator Zaffarini. There's thousands of bills that passed. And these are bills that are often pushed forth by folks who have both the incentive, they have 2 things, they have the incentive and the financial resources to push their bills. And they're often private market participants, or those that are so intertwined with government power, like unions, like you saw this with law enforcement earlier today, that they'll cut off transparency. And if you want to see why we're in the situation we're at with the TPIA, for example, you need to only look at the exceptions. Hundreds and hundreds of exceptions have been lobbied for and have larded up this bill. And over time, because there's so many of them, those that have to process public information requests might have had an easier time of it years ago. But now, they live in the world of exceptions. And that is the default position that they're taking. And unfortunately, it's infecting open meetings and public information. And so there's no excuse for not passing bills, not referring them to a hearing. I think the very duty of a chair of any committee, regardless of party, is to give a full and fair hearing to a transparency measure that has only one constituency, the public, as opposed to giving hearings for virtually, and the percentage is much higher, exceptions to the TPIA, who often always will get a hearing and have their bills flying through. Again, because they're pushed by people who have both the incentive and the financial resources to lobby and get these exceptions passed, or to narrow the funnel of public information. And lifting the veil on that is profoundly important. And in the court of public opinion, it's a perfect venue to do that. When you're reporting on something, it's always worth talking about the public information aspect of what stifled your ability to add more to the story, or that you relied on to provide the public with what they need. And the public needs to know the profound benefit and privilege it is to have these types of laws on the books, because then lawmakers have to respond to them when they keep hearing stories of folks getting stifled, or skeleton crews, or in-depth custody, which is completely outrageous. And basically, it's gamesmanship. TPIA gamesmanship has to come to an end, and unfortunately, it's getting a fair hearing, whereas transparency and the public are not.
Flipping the script a little bit, I want to discuss a bill. This one is bone-chilling to me. A bill that would have allowed governmental entities to redact and withhold information without an attorney general's ruling. It's pretty evident to me why this measure was so concerning, but I'd like to hear from you guys as to where that came from, number one, and why it concerns you.
Yeah. Well, so I'll frame the bill. So I think to understand this bill, you have to appreciate the TPIA at its core and its structure. We're lucky in Texas that anyone, a member of the press or someone way out in the panhandle, can send an open records request, do nothing more, and the default should be they're entitled to, quote, complete information, and also the TPIA guarantees that the government doesn't get to decide what they're entitled to. They get the information they can request. The default is that information is public. So you ask for it once, and you're done. The government then gets to try to invoke exceptions, and the primary pathway to get the sanction of, yes, you can use the exception, is kicking it up to the AG's office. So the AG's office is rightfully, burdened by tens of thousands of requests for exceptions. Now that's not because there's too many open records requests, that's because there's too many exceptions. And so the AG's office decided to address this burden on their workload bill by doing something that goes to the core and structure of the TPIA. It would allow governmental entities to invoke an exception or redact, and that's it. If you're the requester, you now have to do a second thing. In other words, it imposed a burden on requesters that did not exist before, and that is asking for your information a second time. And the second time is that you'd have to trigger an appeal. Now that's different than making an open records request. Making an open records request is asking for information you're entitled to. Being told no and then kicking it off in an appellate posture with the Attorney General of the state of Texas might be easy for a civil rights lawyer like me. It's not easy for most Texans. And so what the bill sought to do is flip the presumption that you're entitled to public information, you ask for it once and you get it. Unless an exception applies, you might have a little bit less information, but you ask for it once. This bill would have required people to ask for the information twice. And what it's banking on to lower the workload at the AG's level is that many people will not ask for the information a second time, and as a result, the workload will decrease. So let's think about that. The cost on people are that the people who do not ask for it a second time will be deprived of information. The public will be deprived of information. How much? Tens of thousands and tens of thousands of pages of information will now no longer enter the public domain month after month after month after month after month. The aggregate of what of the consequence there is staggering, because you never know what you're going to get sometimes when you're rightfully skeptical that maybe something's not going right or you'd like to know more about a certain issue. So this bill sought to flip things on its head by inserting this appeal provision. And so a local government could get a request, invoke an exception, tell you to pound sand unless you want to appeal. As opposed to what's going on today under the Act and as originally framed by the framers of the TPIA. You ask once, the local entity gets a claim, some exceptions apply, and lets the AG's office kind of operate in this quasi position where they get to adjudicate whether, throughout their framework, whether an exception actually applies. Initiate a letter ruling, submit it, and then the governmental entity that wanted to withhold information either gets to or doesn't get to. That core protection, the AG process, is central to this because it results in people just asking for information once, not twice. And so I think if you take a step back and look at the big picture, the TPIA is framed and it's in a way where it empowers individuals. And it does so in a really meaningful and profound way where anyone, lawyer or not, can ask for this information and it's presumed public. And I think you have to view the structure of the TPIA against the structure of the Texas Constitution. The Texas Constitution is structured as a charter of liberty. Article 1 is the Bill of Rights, and it makes clear when you read the opening of the Constitution that we created this government to secure our rights. These are pre-existing rights, that's why it says to secure rights. And there, the default is there's liberty unless there's the exception, which is government power. The TPIA is framed along the same way, where the presumption is that you get your information. The exception is that the government says, there's an exception, and then they have to justify it. By flipping it on its head, you're really creating this unnecessary tension between the guarantees that we have as people living in this state under our Constitution, a presumption of liberty with a big sea of liberty with islands of power that are defined and confined, and a TPIA which allows us to keep an eye on whether the promise of liberty enshrined in our Constitution is actually being taken care of by our government. By flipping things on its head, whether it was intentional or not, the consequences of which were intentional or not, the AG's office, I think, got it wrong. And I think, we'll hopefully work with folks, here today on getting it right. Because there's other ways of enforcing the TPIA to reduce the workload on the AG's office. And those ways should not come at the expense of requesters. No one should be required to ask for their information twice, ever. And I think if that ever comes to fore again, folks across the ideological spectrum should recognize that it's important to put a line in the sand and say, we're not going to tolerate this. And those that advocate for this are simply, again, I think, fallen into this bureaucratic trap of, we have to deal with the TPIA. Oh, it is burdensome. It shouldn't be burdensome if it was constructed properly. It's burdensome because it's larded up with exceptions, and it's burdensome because people in the bureaucracy have not had the leadership necessary to view it for what it is, as I described it, but instead as a necessary evil almost within the culture of the bureaucracy. That has to change. That takes leadership, People at the legislature have to lead. People at the AG's office have to lead. And I think they do want to. But when a bill like this comes out, which is neither conservative nor respective of the intent, purpose, and designed framework of the TPIA, it's incumbent upon all of us to flash that light as brightly as possible so that it never comes close ever again. Both these things got a hearing. Both of them had to be stifled at the very end of session because they were completely wrong on why you have the Public Information Act in the first place, and sought to really change the inner core of the TPIA. And so luckily, the wider body of the legislature and the mechanics that are involved within the processes worked in preventing this type of bill from reaching the governor's desk. But if it did, this would have hurt every single person, regardless of political persuasion or ideological persuasion, and we should never tolerate it again.
James, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, it's clear that the AG's office workload has gone up significantly from requests that have increased from, I've got numbers here, 19,000 records decision requests in 2011 up to 34,000 in 2020. Do you see this as something that's coming back and that we'll need to mount an offense against?
Well, Reef's tough to follow, but I think the numbers that you highlighted there really signal to me the greater problem, which Reef has absolutely hammered home, is that we have far too many exceptions that local governments are leaning on. And that, I think, is the next frontier, is addressing all of the various exceptions in the law to really bring it back home to where that opening preamble is aiming. One manifestation that I encounter frequently of these exceptions relates to the use of economic development, to the occurrence of economic development negotiations that tend to happen behind closed doors. So you have a school district who perhaps offers an incoming or interested business a Chapter 313 agreement. The details of that particular arrangement will get hammered out in executive session or away from the public spotlight. And then when the details have been finalized, that issue tends to be brought to, put on a public agenda and pass through relatively quickly without allowing the public without allowing sufficient time to really digest what's being put forward and understand what they are potentially obligated for. And so that's just one manifestation of it. I think there are far too many exceptions, and ultimately as we move forward, if we're going to have a robust back and forth informed by data and information, then we need to address the far too numerous exceptions in the law.
Laura, I know you have something to say on that in regards to an enforcement to ensure some accountability.
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to flip this back to James, but just to add a little color to Arif's commentary about the bill in particular, the motivation for that bill was to reduce the workload of the AG's office. And the way we saw that was, then you need to address the bad actors. You need to address those governmental entities that are taking advantage of the system and kicking everything up to the AG's office every single time they can, and really inundating that office with so much unnecessary work. That is the core of the problem. Not, the requester, but the bad acting governmental entities. And there is nothing in our TPIA that really addresses that issue. We proposed some alternative language that would address that issue, that would, as Representative Moody was saying, collect data on what governmental entities are habitually making wholesale arguments to avoid responding to TPIA requests. How many of those wholesale arguments are affirmed by the AG versus not affirmed? Let's get at the root of the problem. And that was met with radio silence. There was no appetite for actually digging deep into those bad actors that habitually abuse the system. And so James and the folks at TPPF, I know, have thought of alternative ways to possibly help alleviate the workload at the AG's office and to have better enforcement mechanisms in place. So I'm going to flip back to you.
Laura always asks me the hard questions. So if memory serves correct, and it's been a long year, so it may not, but if memory serves correct, one of the things that we were contemplating at the foundation is instituting some sort of, punitive is probably the wrong word, but some sort of financial element into the PIA process, such that if you're a local government and you come to the AG citing a particular exception, and that exception is rejected, then you are effectively on notice that you shouldn't come back continually with that type of request to the AG's office. And if you do, then the AG's office may have an opportunity to assess you some type of fine or fee to account for continually pestering them with the same question or the same exception request. And so I think that's certainly a smart move, and correct me if I'm wrong, Arif, is that also kind of the structure in place in Kansas, if memory serves?
Yeah, so there's versions of this in other states. In Louisville. So Louisville has a provision, Kentucky's open records law has a provision that, once the clock starts ticking, the information has to start moving to the requester, and then on a daily basis, there's fines that get accrued. And you don't want to get, into that box if you're someone processing a request and throwing up meritless exceptions. And these are the type of things that deter kind of settling into the bureaucratic morass where you're just kind of going through the motions and making things as easy as possible by not complying with an open records request or abusing exceptions and not really going through and doing the work. Yeah.
Another area of bad behavior that I think merits legislative attention has to do with these quasi-public-private entities. And what I mean is that a few years ago, this is an interesting example, where you had the city of Austin effectively engaged in negotiations on behalf of a lot of governmental entities here in Central Texas, and they were engaged in those negotiations with Amazon for HQ2. And so this is, 3-4 years ago. And in the process of trying to understand what Austin was spearheading, nobody could get the details of the economic development package that was being offered to Amazon. And in my back and forth with the city trying to understand, well, you guys are clearly offering something, what is it? It came to my attention that they were effectively using the Chamber of Commerce as an in-between. And so in doing so, they put up an obstacle to the PIA process. And Austin's not alone. I'm not trying to hammer Austin here. But I do think it's an interesting illustration where you have these third-party governmental entities who may or may not be subject to the PIA, and it's really kind of gumming up the process. I think in some ways the code needs to be updated to account for some of these stranger incidences which still potentially obligate the public in a very meaningful way but exclude them from the process.
And when you see these types of things happen, like the negotiations, or with, just to pull another big picture here, or with death in custody, you see the same theme reoccur, where, well, now we're going to use taxpayer money to try to get a private market participant to come here, and we're not going to negotiate with palms up in public since we're using taxpayer funds. We're going to try to shield it by going through an intermediary. Or when we exceed the bounds of government power and someone dies in our custody, we're going to try to stitch together some exceptions so that, we don't really have to pronounce to the public what happened and explain palms up how we exercise the power that we are entrusted to wield. That's the common thread in just about any excess that you see under the TPIA where they don't want to share information or make it really hard to get information. You're at the outer limit of the ability to exercise power, and you're willing to go into that gray area. And I think it really speaks to what they actually think they're doing when they want to shield information about what they're doing. which means that if you have to err on that side, you should just say no, and that goes to leadership. And that's why the leaders that are entrusted with all these levers of power have to take a more meaningful role when it comes to public information and open meetings. And being palms up is not a disadvantage, it's actually a strength. And it's a strength for our community here in Austin if they would have negotiated on the Amazon deal, for example, in public and not be shy about it. We have a great city, and they want to be here. It's not rocket science. And trying to hide behind exceptions and intermediaries just kind of reflects something that I don't think none of us want to reflect, and that is that we're the type of society that needs to do things when we exercise power and use taxpayer money outside of the public's eye. That's just at odds with, again, the TPIA and why the government exists in the first place.
Well, we have reached our time limit. I've been authorized to go just a little bit over. We don't want to rob of our transition or our lunchtime. If anybody has any questions. Any questions out there? Eva Ruth?
I was curious, the 1810, some of this like really low-hanging fruit when it comes to transparency. I'm curious if y'all can speak candidly about like when things changed in Texas, because it wasn't that long ago that everyone could agree that data helps everyone make better decisions. And so I'm curious about like when this skepticism and like just hard no to transparency of any sort, even changing the format. Like there are reports that I get every month that I know have been changed from an Excel spreadsheet into a PDF.
Right.
Just so that they can make it harder for our team to clean and use this data. So when did that start, or and why? If anybody can speak candidly about that.
To restate the question for those of you who are streaming in, she asked when things changed in Texas and when this increased level of skepticism and reticence to transparency became the norm.
So I don't know necessarily globally how to address that. I can tell you with regard to the 1810, the searchable sortable bill, I had lawmakers' offices, powerful lawmakers' offices that said to me that they were concerned about giving out spreadsheets in a manner in which journalists or the public could manipulate the data and then disseminate fake news. So leave it to yourself as to when fake news became a thing, but that's when we started to hear that sort of pushback.
I think that answers the question quite clearly. Yes.
I thought my name's Jeff Morgan, and I just want to say, the legislative hearings are all online, and they're archived, and I think it's wonderful, because if we can't be there in person, we can't see how our government's operating, discussing bills. But again, to go back to the court issue again, we don't have anything like this. Right now, the courts, if they have a Zoom meeting, they immediately shut it down and they do not archive it. Our Supreme Court does. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are regarding that, because in communication, we have not just verbal, but nonverbal communication that's not captured by transcripts. I've heard court reporters say, I didn't get this. And I know in Tennessee they have a situation, I'm pretty sure that once a hearing is done, the litigants get a copy of the DVD or the CD so that they can take with them. It helps to give justice to poor people who can't afford $3,000 for a transcript. Any comments about that?
The question from Mr. Morgan was, he expressed gratitude that the legislative hearings are all online and then are archived for people to go back and look at them. He's not seeing that same thing in the courts where if they are online, they are not archived and immediately disposed of. Do we see that changing?
So I would encourage you to get involved in a process that's going on right now. With COVID, that so many of the Texas courts have have pivoted to YouTube hearings, and those YouTube hearings are open to the public. The Texas Supreme Court Rules Advisory Committee right now has set up a subcommittee to evaluate Rule 18C. Rule 18C is the rule that deals with cameras in the courtroom. And one of the things that they are looking at and evaluating is what to do about things like archival issues and instructions. This is really troubling to me. Instructions of anybody who is viewing or participating in the process that they can't capture the video and they can't then disseminate the information, which is truly, that's a prior restraint. If you're telling somebody you can't disseminate information that occurred in an open proceeding in courtrooms, since when is that a thing? That's absolutely not permissible under our Constitution. And yet you get those instructions virtually every single time you participate in a virtual proceeding. So that subcommittee is going on right now with the Texas Supreme Court Rules Advisory Committee. I would call them up and say, I would like to be heard on this.
Okay, thank you. I had no idea. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And when you think about the courts, remember, we have separation of powers. So the legislature can make laws that govern the creatures it creates, right? Like municipalities and, you know, what's within its purview. But then there's a line where the courts have a distinct constitutional power to run that branch of government separately. So it has to check the legislature.
So long as it does not violate the Constitution.
Absolutely.
Right.
So
And
long
that's
as
the
it doesn't
important key
violate
part,
the Constitution. Was
and I hope that there's, you know, as a practitioner in court, I've never, you know, experienced this until COVID, doing hearings remote or on the phone, seeing it's just, everything's different, and it's different for the advocates. But I think it's really important that the public gets to see, because they've been able to see what happens in court, because that's how you educate the public in the court of public opinion. You know, no one can just make their way to a courthouse. People don't want to go to a courthouse, but great things happen in courthouses, and it's important to project that to the public. And I think, you know, having oral argument archived at the Texas Supreme Court's website is great. I think the YouTube live feeds are great. And I think more people will learn about the courts, will learn about how to access the courts, and how to meaningfully use the courts to protect their rights. These are all fundamental things that everyone should really want more of. And a lot of judges you'll see participate and attorneys participate in efforts for having equal access to justice and teaching people on the lower rungs of the economic ladder how to access those tribunals to protect their rights. And so projecting that, I think the court recognizes as the high court in a more meaningful way, and keeping some of these things from COVID moving forward are going to be important. And so it's important that we keep pushing for that, especially while they're making the rules.
Thank
It
you.
really is a pivotal time. It really is a pivotal time, the dissemination of information, and a time that we need folks like this to have our back and be shaping the way that we're going forward. So I want to thank all of you for participating today, and Senator Zaffarini for sending the message that she did. We couldn't have found more knowledgeable people to speak on the topic, and I appreciate your time. I think now we are going to adjourn until lunch, which is at noon, and that will give us some time to mill about and visit, and also give our technical crew some time to realign and set up for lunch and for what we have coming up. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you at lunch.